The silence of the cell was not empty. It was a heavy, living thing, stuffed full of screams that had nowhere to go. The air in Salem Town Jail tasted of stale sweat, damp earth, and an insidious fear that clung to the throat like cobwebs. The cell was a crypt of fieldstone and mortar, lit only by a miserly slit of window high above, which allowed a pale, watery rectangle of morning sun to stretch across the floor before being swallowed by the gloom. Eleanor Vane sat on a thin, rotting pallet, her back pressed against the cold, unforgiving stone. She was 32, a widow, and a woman who until 3 weeks ago had held her head high on the King's Road. Now her neat, flaxen hair was matted, and her usually sharp, intelligent eyes were ringed with exhaustion. But the fire in their deep blue centers had not diminished. It had only been refined, honed down to a single, deadly point: revenge. Her accusation had been swift and brutal. It wasn't the usual murmur of a failed crop or a sick cow. It had come from the mouth of Patience Hawthorne, a 16-year-old girl known for her pious demeanor and sudden terrifying fits. "She came to me in the darkest hour," Patience had shrieked to the gathered magistrate, her body contorting like a broken doll. "A shadow with Eleanor's face. She pressed a cold book to my hand and bade me sign the devil's pact. Her familiar, a great black raven, did whisper blasphemies into my ear." A raven. The absurdity of it still made Eleanor's lips twist into a silent, bitter laugh. Her actual familiar was a small, well-worn volume of Virgil's poetry, hidden under the loose floorboard of her cottage, a far cry from a satanic ledger. But in Salem, 1692, an educated woman who managed her late husband's property better than any man was a threat. A woman who refused to remarry and bow to a man's authority was an anomaly. An anomaly in these days of feverish panic was a witch. Eleanor slowly ran her finger across the rough mortar of the wall. She wasn't cold. The fury radiating from her was a hot, constant fever. She had used her time in this stone cage not to pray for deliverance, nor to weep for her fate, but to analyze, to dissect the trial, the players, and the very weak points in the righteous armor of her accusers. The magistrates, Thomas Danforth, a man of rigid law and even more rigid ambition, who saw every conviction as a step up the colonial ladder. The accusers, Patience Hawthorne, the primary instrument, a girl whose performance was too flawless, too practiced. This was not the raving of hysteria, it was the precision of malice. The community, the greedy neighbors who had long coveted the patch of fertile land Eleanor had inherited, the very men who were now carving up her estate, presuming her condemnation. "They will pay," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp that barely disturbed the dust motes dancing in the narrow ray of light. They thought the prison had broken her. They thought the damp, the hunger, and the incessant fear had softened her mind for confession and repentance. They were wrong. The prison had not broken her. It had simply cleared her vision. The bars were not to keep her in, they were to keep her safe until she was strong enough to execute her plan. She had already found the means. Beneath her pallet, where the stone had been chiseled unevenly, she had found a hidden advantage, a small dark space where the chill of the earth was constant, and a very particular, very poisonous herb she had learned about in a forgotten medicinal text now in the custody of the court. It was time to begin the work, time to exchange the victim's mantle for the executioner's cloak. The lock on the heavy oak door scraped loudly. The rough face of a guard, John Poole, peered in. "Vane, you got a visitor, a man of the cloth, come to save your heathen soul." Eleanor rose, her gaze steady, her posture defiant. The guard's eyes flickered with a strange mix of lust and fear, the two most dangerous emotions in Salem. She didn't flinch. She needed to manipulate, not merely survive. The Reverend, an unexpected yet perfect first target. What is the first most powerful tool a falsely accused witch must learn to wield? Eleanor's heart, though pounding with purpose, maintained a calm rhythm as she stepped toward the bars. The guard, Poole, unlocked the door but did not fully open it. He remained stationed outside, his shadow falling across the floor like a promise of threat. The visitor was Reverend Timothy Alden, a newcomer to the colony, replacing the last minister who had died, some whispered, of a sudden mysterious illness. Alden was younger than Eleanor, perhaps 28, with soft, earnest eyes that hadn't yet been hardened by the prevailing hysteria. He wore a simple black cassock and clutched a heavy Bible against his chest as if it were a shield against the devil's work he expected to find here. "Sister Vane," Alden began, his voice a tremor of forced solemnity, "I am here to offer solace and to, God willing, guide you toward confession and redemption before the time runs out." Eleanor lowered her gaze, adopting the perfect mask of the tormented, weary soul. She allowed her shoulders to slump just so, suggesting fatigue, not defeat. "Reverend Alden, your kindness is a balm in this wretched place, but I have nothing to confess, save for the profound misfortune of being misunderstood." "Misunderstood?" Alden leaned closer to the bars, concern clouding his face. "Child, 3 righteous girls have sworn before the court that they saw your spectral form torment them. Can you truly deny the power that possesses you?" This was the critical moment. She had to shift his perception, not with outright defiance, which would only confirm his prejudice, but with carefully curated vulnerability. "Reverend," she whispered, raising her eyes, which were now shimmering, not with tears of sorrow, but tears of calculated stress. "I deny the wickedness, yes, but I do not deny the torment." She paused, letting the silence hang heavy. "These girls, Patience Hawthorne, Deliverance Corey, they are troubled, deeply troubled. I believe they are indeed afflicted, but not by me, by something else, something unseen, and perhaps something closer to them than any of us dare to admit." Alden's brow furrowed. This was a deviation from the usual pattern of frantic denial or aggressive cursing. Eleanor was presenting herself as a fellow observer, a victim who was also a sage. "You have seen this resentment?" he asked, his voice low. "I have seen her in meeting halls, Reverend. I have observed the way she shrinks from his gaze, yet always finds a way to be near him. The way she controls the room with her fits. A child who lacks power often seeks it in desperate, theatrical ways. Is that not a truth we must consider, even if it is a bitter pill to swallow?" Eleanor's words were carefully chosen, pious-sounding, yet subtly damning. She had just introduced the idea that the heart of the witch panic was internal and familial, shifting the blame away from herself and toward the primary accuser and the chief judge. Alden remained silent for a long moment, the grip on his Bible slackening slightly. He was clearly disturbed. I must pray on this, Sister Vane. I must consider your words." "Do, Reverend. And while you are out there seeking the real truth, perhaps you could do me one small, final kindness?" She gestured weakly to her side.
My husband's favorite book, Virgil's Aeneid. It is likely still in my cottage, under the floorboard by the hearth. The binding is worn, a gift from him. If I am to meet my end soon, I only wish to read those familiar words one last time. It is not witchcraft, Reverend. It is merely memory. The request was sentimental, harmless, and perfectly calculated. The Aeneid itself was meaningless. The fact that she knew exactly where it was hidden, a tiny space perfect for concealing other, more crucial items, was what mattered. It was her first test of his faith in her innocence and his willingness to act against the general tide of fear. As Alden turned to leave, Eleanor offered a faint, grateful smile that was pure, heartbreaking pathos. Thank you, Reverend. May your heart remain open to light, even when the darkness tries to trick you. She knew he would find the cottage watched, but the minister's presence would allow him to retrieve the book and whatever might be hidden there without immediate suspicion. The path to her freedom required tools, and the Reverend was now unwittingly her delivery boy. Reverend Alden's visit bought Eleanor 2 crucial days of peace. Poole, the guard, seemed to view the minister's intervention as a sign that Eleanor might indeed be breaking, and his vigilance slackened, replaced by a slightly smug, pitying curiosity. Eleanor spent the time observing the routine of the jail, the grinding schedule of shift changes, meal deliveries, and the rhythmic, muffled sobbing of the other accused women. On the 3rd day, just before the midday meal, the heavy outer door creaked open again. This time it was Poole alone, holding a battered leather-bound book. "The minister was true to his word, Vane," he grumbled, sliding the book through the small, low opening at the bottom of the bars, the slot usually reserved for a chamber pot. He kicked it toward her with his boot. "He said it was nothing but verses. If you use it for spells, I swear I'll take the hide off you myself." Eleanor picked up the book. The familiar, rich scent of old paper and leather filled her nostrils. It was Virgil's Aeneid, her husband's gift. She pressed it against her chest for a moment, letting the gesture sell her sincerity to the observing guard. "Thank you, John," she said softly, using his name to disarm him. "It means everything." Poole grunted and walked away, satisfied that he had done his duty and confirmed her sentimentality. As soon as the echoing scrape of the main door had faded, Eleanor's false composure vanished. She didn't open the book to read. She ran her fingers along the spine, feeling for the slight irregularity near the center. Eleanor was not only educated in classics, she had also, in her youth, learned the rudimentary principles of bookbinding from a traveling artisan who had traded his skill for her family's hospitality. She quickly worked a fingernail into a small, deliberately loose section of the spine on the inside cover. With a delicate, firm tug, a section of the pages near the center of the book detached, not as loose sheets, but as a carefully hollowed-out compartment. Inside, resting on the velvety fibers of the cut paper, were 3 items. A tightly rolled piece of parchment, not much larger than her thumb. A small, flat pebble of black obsidian, cool to the touch. A tiny, thin vial stoppered with beeswax, containing a dark, slightly viscous liquid. This was no witchcraft. This was her armory. The parchment, the list. She unrolled the parchment. It was a recent, hastily scribbled list of names and notes from her hidden cache, written by her own hand and intended to be retrieved only in case of legal trouble. It contained key facts she needed to leverage. Patience Hawthorne, debt of £5 owed by her father, Samuel, to T. Danforth, payable at harvest. Motive for the performance, currying favor to extend the debt. Magistrate Danforth, large untreated gout in the left foot, a physical weakness to exploit. Guard Poole, Wife Martha suffers from lung consumption, requires specific poppy syrup, a personal need to leverage for favors. The obsidian, the tool. The obsidian pebble was sharp along one edge, polished by years of rubbing against other items in the cache. It was the perfect instrument for scoring wood, scraping stone, or, most importantly, for carefully opening the wax stopper on the vial. The vial, the agent. This was the most critical item. It was not a potion, but a poison. Eleanor, an amateur scholar of medicinal and botanical texts, a pursuit now labeled witchcraft, knew the properties of the digitalis preparia plant, or foxglove. The liquid inside was a highly concentrated tincture from the leaves, carefully prepared to be colorless, tasteless, and effective in extremely small, repeated doses. In the right amount, it induced nausea, vomiting, and most importantly for her purposes, convulsions, hallucinations, and delirium.
The very symptoms attributed to the bewitched girls. A plan, intricate and terrible, snapped into place. She would not escape physically yet. First, she would escape through the minds of her accusers. She would prove, with a horrifying, manufactured certainty, that the true witch was still operating, and that Eleanor Vane was merely a distraction. She needed an accomplice, a willing or unwitting agent inside the jail, and she needed to target the magistrate himself. Eleanor re-stopper Belial and hid the 3 items under her pallet, precisely where she had found the cold, small space. She opened the Aeneid to a random page and began to read, her lips moving silently, projecting the image of a defeated woman seeking solace. But the words on the page were meaningless. Her mind was already on the next step, using Poole's sick wife as leverage to secure access to Danforth's personal quarters. She looked up at the slit of a window. The sun was setting, casting the room in a bloody, fading red. The devil's work, they call it. Let them see what true, focused malice looks like. The opportunity presented itself that evening. Poole, the guard, was on the night watch, his pacing outside her cell slow and labored. He coughed frequently, a dry, rattling sound that hinted at the same contagion plaguing his home. Eleanor waited until the deepest part of the night, when the silence was thick enough to carry the slightest whisper. "John," she called out softly, using his name again, injecting it with careful concern. Poole stopped outside her cell. "What is it, Vane? Shut your noise." "I apologize, John, for disturbing your watch, but I hear your cough. It's a harsh sound. Is it the night air, or the trouble you carry in your heart?" Poole shifted uncomfortably. "Keep your witchery out of my affairs." "It is not witchery, John. It is observation. You worry for your Martha. Her lum consumption is a slow, cruel executioner, is it not?" The air froze. Poole stepped right up to the bars, his face a shadow contorted with sudden rage and fear. "How dare you speak of her? How do you know of Martha's ill fortune?" Eleanor allowed a hint of knowing sorrow to enter her voice. "Because, John, I am accused of possessing knowledge that allows me to heal just as easily as to harm. I have studied the natural world since I was a girl. I know the symptoms of the wasting illness, and I know a remedy that your poor physician will never prescribe." She had his full, terrified attention now. She had hit the raw nerve of his deepest vulnerability. "What remedy?" Poole demanded, his voice dropping to a desperate, hoarse whisper.
"A tincture of sanguinaria or bloodroot," she lied smoothly, naming a common, recognizable, yet ineffective colonial remedy to maintain credibility. "It does not cure, but it eases the harshness, lessens the coughing, and helps the patient rest. I kept a small supply for myself when my husband fell ill. It should still be in my cottage cellar, in a locked small oak box marked with a silver V." She paused, letting the immense difficulty of obtaining it sink in. "It is useless to me now, of course, but it could buy your Martha weeks, perhaps months of comfort." Poole's face was a roadmap of internal struggle. To accept anything from an accused witch was to risk his soul, but to let his wife suffer when a chance for ease was offered. "What do you ask for it, Vane?" His voice was edged with suspicion. "What price?" Eleanor smiled, a faint, sad curve of her lips that Poole mistook for piety. "I ask for no spells, John. I ask only for information. I am already doomed, it seems, but I would like to understand the true nature of the evil that has struck this town." She leaned closer, lowering her voice until it was almost a breath. "Magistrate Danforth holds the key to the court proceedings. I want to know who visits him late at night, who he trusts, and, this is most important, where he keeps his cordial." "His cordial? What devilry is that?" "No devilry, John. He suffers terribly from the gout, does he not?" Eleanor pressed, using the information from the parchment. "The pain keeps him awake. He takes a potent herbal cordial, a dark liqueur, to soothe his misery and help him sleep. He keeps it close, locked away. I need to know where and how he accesses it. Tell me this, and the knowledge of the bloodroot is yours." The request was deceptively benign. Asking about a judge's nightly drink seemed far less dangerous than asking for legal documents or a key. It seemed like the curiosity of a condemned woman. Poole wrestled with it for another agonizing minute, running a shaking hand through his thinning hair. The thought of Martha gasping for breath finally won over the fear of the Almighty. "He keeps the cordial in a small locked silver-clasped chest in his study. The key hangs on a peg inside the cloak of his greatcoat, which is always left on the peg by the rear door. He drinks it just before he puts the fire out. No one else touches it. He trusts no one with his weakness." "And who visits him?" Eleanor prompted. "His cousin, Elias. Always Elias. They speak of landholdings, not witchery. And sometimes Reverend Paris, but not late. Only family and Elias are allowed late." Eleanor absorbed this. The cordial, the location of the key, the routine. It was everything she needed. "Good, John. Now listen carefully to my instructions for the cottage. Go when the moon is waning. Do not light a lamp." She gave him precise, easy-to-follow directions for retrieving the useless bloodroot, giving him a false sense of success, while already plotting how to get the digitalis tincture into Danforth's personal supply. The exchange was complete. Eleanor had turned a desperate man's love for his wife into her first weapon. The judge's pain would soon become the entire town's agony.
Eleanor waited 3 days. She knew Poole was agonizing over the retrieval of the alleged bloodroot, hoping it would work while dreading his next conversation with the accused witch. On the 3rd day, just before the evening change of guard, Poole returned to her cell. He was pale and agitated, his hands shaking as he slid her meager supper through the slot.
"I did as you asked," he muttered, refusing to meet her eyes. "The box was there. The bottle. Martha drank a dose this morning. She slept without coughing for 3 hours." He was grasping for hope, desperate to believe in the ineffective tincture he had retrieved. "I am relieved for you, John," Eleanor said softly, her tone laced with just the right mix of pity and quiet power. "Now, I need your aid one last time. It concerns Danforth." Poole recoiled slightly. "I told you what you asked. I can't do more. It is treason." "It is not treason, John. It is salvation," Eleanor corrected, leaning close to the bars. "Listen to me. The route I gave you is strong, but it is only half of the cure. Martha's humors are unbalanced. To restore her, she needs an artifact from the place where the corruption began, the place of highest authority." This was pure, unadulterated psychological manipulation, designed to appeal to the superstitious core of his faith. "What artifact?" Poole whispered, his eyes wide. "A piece of Magistrate Danforth's personal silver." Eleanor's voice was barely a breath. "For no theft, John, but for cleansing. Silver has properties that ward off evil influences. I need you to procure one thing, the small silver funnel he uses to pour his cordial. It will be in the clasped chest near the cordial. Bring it to me tonight, then return it immediately after." The request was strange, harmless sounding, and deeply compelling in its esoteric nature. A small, functional item of silver. It seemed a minor risk for the promised salvation of his wife. Poole hesitated for the longest time, his face a mask of conflict. Finally, the image of Martha's peaceful brief sleep won out. "The late shift starts at midnight," he said, his words clipped and heavy with self-loathing. "Danforth is always sound asleep by 2 bells. I will be patrolling his hall at 3. I will try." At 3:15 a.m., the guard's footsteps halted outside Eleanor's cell. The faint jingle of metal preceded a small, delicate object being slid through the gap. Eleanor seized it. It was a beautiful, small silver funnel, finely crafted, clearly intended for decanting small amounts of precious liquid. She did not waste a second. Working quickly but precisely, using the small obsidian pebble like a scalpel, she carefully chipped away a minute fragment of the beeswax stopper on the digitalis vial. She held the silver funnel upright. The well of the funnel was tiny. Using the very tip of the obsidian, she allowed exactly 3 small, distinct droplets of the dark, viscous tincture to run into the funnel's mouth. 3 droplets. Not enough to kill outright, but more than enough to induce the symptoms of a terrifying supernatural affliction. Intense gastrointestinal distress, vision disturbances, headaches, and, most damningly, hallucinations and convulsions. She had, in effect, bewitched the instrument of the court's highest judge. Eleanor wrapped the funnel in a piece of her own clean linen, making sure none of the droplets were wiped away, and slid it back through the slot just as Poole's footsteps sounded. "It is done, John. Return it to its place immediately, and gel no soul. May God grant peace to your Martha." Poole snatched the funnel back, his eyes darting nervously in the gloom. He was breathing heavily, a man who had crossed a line he could never uncross. He locked the funnel safely away, convinced he was performing a desperate act of healing. As the heavy lock on the main door scraped shut, signaling Poole's final departure, Eleanor lay back on her pallet. She closed her eyes, not in sleep, but in deadly anticipation. The poisoning of Thomas Danforth was not an end, but a beginning. In the fevered, panic-stricken mind of Salem, the chief magistrate's sudden, terrifying illness, which would mirror the fits of the afflicted girls, could only mean one thing. The devil's work had touched the very seat of justice. And when Danforth began to writhe and scream, Eleanor Vane would be the only person in Salem who had the key to explaining his torment. The news reached the jail like a thrown stone, shattering the morning's false calm. It was delivered by a panicked, breathless clerk who rushed to the cells to inform the guards. John Poole, who had just begun his shift, stood frozen near Eleanor's door, his face ashen, while the clerk sputtered the impossible. Magistrate Thomas Danforth had suffered a grievous attack during the night. Eleanor, sitting serenely on her pallet, strained her ears, piecing together the frantic whispers filtering through the thick stone walls. The symptoms described were terrifying and familiar. Violent retches and nausea. Danforth had been violently sick. Vision disturbances. He was screaming about seeing yellow devils and flickering halos around the candlelight. Convulsions and delirium. He was found writhing in his bed, clutching his chest, muttering about cold claws on his heart, and shrieked words of a confession, though the content was incoherent. The most damning detail was that his attack mirrored almost perfectly the worst reported fits of Patience Hawthorne and the other afflicted girls, the very fits used as evidence against Eleanor. Poole stumbled away from the bars, his eyes wide and vacant. He looked at Eleanor, then back at the door, a terrible realization dawning in his mind. The silver funnel. He hadn't procured a cure for his wife. He had delivered a curse to the judge.
Eleanor wrapped the funnel in a piece of her own clean linen, making sure none of the droplets were wiped away, and slid it back through the slot just as Poole's footsteps sounded. "It is done, John. Return it to its place immediately, and tell no soul. May God grant peace to your Martha." Poole snatched the funnel back, his eyes darting nervously in the gloom. He was breathing heavily, a man who had crossed a line he could never uncross. He locked the funnel safely away, convinced he was performing a desperate act of healing. As the heavy lock on the main door scraped shut, signaling Poole's final departure, Eleanor lay back on her pallet. She closed her eyes not in sleep, but in deadly anticipation. The poisoning of Thomas Danforth was not an end, but a beginning. In the fevered, panic-stricken mind of Salem, the chief magistrate's sudden, terrifying illness, which would mirror the fits of the afflicted girls, could only mean one thing. The devil's work had touched the very seat of justice. And when Danforth began to writhe and scream, Eleanor Vane would be the only person in Salem who had the key to explaining his torment. The plot was no longer about escaping. It was about tearing down the framework of justice that had imprisoned her. The news reached the gal like a thrown stone, shattering the morning's false calm. It was delivered by a panicked, breathless clerk who rushed to the cells to inform the guards. John Poole, who had just begun his shift, stood frozen near Eleanor's door, his face ashen, while the clerk sputtered the impossible. Magistrate Thomas Danforth had suffered a grievous attack during the night. Eleanor, sitting serenely on her pallet, strained her ears, piecing together the frantic whispers filtering through the thick stone walls. The symptoms described were terrifying and familiar. Violent retches and nausea. Danforth had been violently sick. Vision disturbances. He was screaming about seeing yellow devils and flickering halos around the candlelight. Convulsions and delirium.
He was found writhing in his bed, clutching his chest, muttering about cold claws on his heart, and shrieked words of a confession, though the content was incoherent. The most damning detail was that his attack mirrored, almost perfectly, the worst reported fits of Patience Hawthorne and the other afflicted girls, the very fits used as evidence against Eleanor Vane. Poole stumbled away from the bars, his eyes wide and vacant. He looked at Eleanor, then back at the door, a terrible realization dawning in his mind. The silver funnel. He hadn't procured a cure for his wife. He had delivered a curse to the judge. Eleanor allowed a flicker of chilling satisfaction to cross her face, then quickly replaced it with an expression of profound spiritual concern. "John, what have they done to the poor man?" Poole just shook his head, unable to speak, trapped by a guilt so enormous it was choking him. "The devil is clever, John. He does not always strike the most obvious targets. He strikes the strongest pillar, so that everything else may collapse around it. The true witch of Salem must be protected by the devil's hand if she can bring down a magistrate." The clerk's frantic voice carried back down the hall. "The court must be suspended. The judge is possessed. The devil has struck the very seat of our authority." The turning tide. By mid-afternoon, the prison was a hub of terrified gossip. The people of Salem, already on the brink of hysteria, were confronted with a terror that defied their understanding. If the magistrate himself could be so violently afflicted, then the devil's reach was not limited to the peripheral members of society. The narrative began to shift, exactly as Eleanor had calculated. Doubt of innocence. No one doubted the judge's piety. Therefore, if he was afflicted, it proved that the true witch was still at large and far more powerful than anyone realized. Focus on the accusers. Why would the devil strike the magistrate, yet leave the initial accusers, Patience Hawthorne and the others, untouched by this specific violent form of affliction? Suspicion began to creep toward the possibility that the girls were either mistaken or, more darkly, complicit. The great stroke of luck for Eleanor was that Danforth's physician, having no knowledge of digitalis poisoning, would simply assume the symptoms were the result of a powerful demonic attack or a failure of the patient's own spiritual defenses. They would treat him with bleeding, prayers, and useless herbal decoctions, ensuring the poison continued its slow, agonizing work. Eleanor waited. She needed a clear opportunity to plant the final seed, the one that would exonerate her while simultaneously executing her true revenge. That opportunity arrived in the form of a small, middle-aged woman named Martha Poole, the guard's wife. Poole, distraught and terrified by the judge's fate, had finally shared Eleanor's cleansing request with his wife. Martha, desperate to escape her own illness, had clung to the idea of the witch's cure. She was now at the gaol, dressed in a faded shawl, her breathing shallow, but her determination resolute. "Sister Vane," she rasped, placing her trembling hands on the cold bars. Martha's eyes, dull with illness, held a glint of desperation and a fresh, furious belief in Eleanor's power, not as a witch, but as a cunning woman who could influence fate. Eleanor looked Martha directly in the eye and delivered the final, calculated truth. "Martha, you are saved because your husband acted out of love, not malice. The silver was clean. But the judge, dear woman, suffers because the true witch did not want to see her own secret." Eleanor then spoke the name of her chief accuser, loud enough for the trembling Poole outside the cell to hear. "Patience Hawthorne is the one who carries the devil's work in her heart, not me. and she is the one who will be exposed by the magistrate's own affliction."
The news of Magistrate Danforth's possession had achieved exactly what Eleanor intended: mass confusion and the complete undermining of the court's authority. With the chief judge incapacitated and ranting about yellow smoke and serpents, the trials ground to a halt. Eleanor's immediate task was to ensure the narrative she gave Martha Poole and the guilt-ridden John Poole took root and spread through the colony like wildfire. She needed to speak. She needed an audience. That morning, Reverend Alden returned, drawn back by a potent mix of professional concern and the lingering seed of doubt Eleanor had planted in his mind days earlier. He was visibly shaken, his idealism struggling against the terrifying reality of Danforth's screams. "Sister Vane," Alden said, his voice strained, "this chaos, it is the devil's doing. Danforth, a man of God, struck down in his own home." Eleanor stood tall, shedding the mask of the pitiful victim entirely. She spoke with the steady, clear conviction of a woman who held an uncomfortable truth. "Reverend Alden, I asked you to pray on the possibility of a non-supernatural affliction, did I not?" Alden nodded, his eyes fixed on hers. "The devil is a master of mimicry. He can make a physical illness look like a spiritual one. But the true danger is simpler and more terrifying, malice born of human flesh." She walked deliberately to the bars, her intensity forcing Alden to lean closer. "I told you that Patience Hawthorne was not afflicted by me, but was misled. Now I tell you the truth I could not speak before. Patience Hawthorne is not misled, Reverend. She is the instrument. She has found that her performance grants her power over the highest authorities in Salem, and she uses that power to clear a path for the ambition of those around her." "Ambition? What are you suggesting?" Alden demanded, his theological training warring with her startling claim. "I am suggesting that Patience Hawthorne, in the dark corners of her soul, covets the power of a witch without bearing the mark of the devil. She has been trained, Reverend, not by demons, but by the very men who wish to profit from this tragedy." She paused, letting the implication land. The witch trials were not a religious crisis, but a political and economic one. "Danforth's illness, which mimics her own fits, is no random stroke of hell. It is a sign. The sickness that struck him down is the same sickness that has infected this community, unjust power." She lowered her voice, knowing that Alden would carry this confession, this theory, to the most influential ears. "Reverend, if you wish to find the true source of this evil, look for who profits from my land. Look for the ledger where Samuel Hawthorne owes Danforth money. Look for the true motivation behind the girl's theatrical tears." The final gambit. Eleanor then pulled the final, high-risk move. She reached into the hollowed-out section of the Aeneid and withdrew the small, black obsidian stone. She held it out to the Reverend, who instinctively flinched away. "This stone, Reverend, is my confession." "A familiar," Alden gasped, crossing himself. "No," Eleanor countered firmly. "It is merely a piece of sharp stone. I held this against the damp wall for 3 weeks. I have used it to scratch a message, not a spell, on the cold stone of this cell, a message of warning." She pointed to a spot on the wall barely visible in the dim light. In tiny, almost invisible lettering, she had scored a short message into the mortar, a message she had prepared with the digitalis in hand. "He who judges the shadow must first know the serpent in his own garden. The sickness is in the cordial. Look to the instrument, not the scapegoat." "The words mean nothing, Reverend. They are a jumble of prophecy," Eleanor insisted, her eyes gleaming. But if the court opens an inquiry into the poisoning of Magistrate Danforth, if they are forced to look away from the devil and towards the man who poured the drink, they will find the evidence, and they will find the funnel still carrying the residue of a common, potent herb that mimics all the signs of witchcraft. She had given them the trail of the poison, the nature of the illness, and the name of the true instrument. She had handed the bewildered minister a path to rational investigation, disguising it as a cryptic message from a possessed yet prophetic prisoner. Alden stared at the tiny inscription, then at the black stone, and finally at Eleanor. He was not looking at a witch anymore. He was looking at a mastermind. He turned and fled the jail, needing to deliver this explosive, terrifying blend of prophecy and procedure to the surviving authorities. Eleanor smiled, a slow, cold expression of triumph. Her life was still in danger, but her revenge was now assured. Salem would no longer search for a woman who signed the devil's book. They would search for a calculating murderer, and the trail led directly to the chief accuser. The price of treason. The investigation into Magistrate Danforth's sudden and terrifying affliction began not with prayer and exorcism, but with a cautious medical inquiry, spurred on by the frantic insistence of Reverend Alden. Eleanor's strategic use of the word cordial and the suggestion of a potent herb in the scratched message had planted an undeniable seed of doubt. Alden, desperate to resolve the paradox, managed to convince the temporary governing council to send a small secular delegation to examine Danforth's study. They found the silver-clasped chest, the cordial bottle, and the small telltale silver funnel, the same one John Poole had cleansed. A careful examination, a rarity in the frenzy of Salem, revealed a faint, lingering dark residue inside the funnel. A quick test by a visiting surgeon confirmed the presence of a powerful, plant-based toxin that induced the exact symptoms Danforth was displaying. The magistrate was not bewitched. He was poisoned.
The revelation was seismic. It ripped the legal foundation out from under the witch trials. If the magistrate's illness was terrestrial, then the girl's fits, which were identical, must also be fabricated or induced. The focus of the court, already destabilized, swung violently from Eleanor Vane to the source of the poisoning. The exposure of patients. The trail, as Eleanor had predicted, led directly to Patience Hawthorne. The small inquiry revealed motive. Eleanor's earlier whispers to Alden about Samuel Hawthorne's debt to Danforth were quickly confirmed. Eliminating Danforth would have provided a powerful favor or leverage. Access. Patience, being the primary afflicted girl and constantly reporting to Danforth, had frequent and unsupervised access to his home and the periphery of his study. Witness, John Poole, his wife seemingly recovering, a psychological effect Eleanor relied on, was broken by guilt. He confessed his part in removing the funnel, confirming that Eleanor had named Patience as the instrument of evil. He was arrested, but his testimony about Eleanor's prophecy lent credence to her claims of innocence. Patience Hawthorne was swiftly seized. Confronted with the evidence of poison, a tangible, material evil, far simpler to understand than the devil's invisible influence, her practiced theatricality crumbled. She broke down, not in a fit, but in genuine, messy hysteria. She did not confess to murder, but to malice and deception, admitting she had been coached by her cousin, Elias, to target Eleanor to help secure Danforth's land after the execution. The silence of Eleanor. On a chilling autumn morning, Eleanor Vane was led out of her cell, not for the gallows, but for a final judgment before the restructured council. She was declared not guilty of witchcraft. Her acquittal was silent, delivered with hurried, shame-faced efficiency by the council, who were desperate to close the chapter of hysteria they had unleashed. They could not execute her, for she was the only one who had exposed the real crime. She was given her freedom and a formal, cold acknowledgment of her stolen property and the time she had spent imprisoned. As she walked out of the jail doors blinking in the crisp sunlight, Eleanor did not look back at the stone prison. She looked across the town square toward the building where Patience Hawthorne was now being held, facing charges of conspiracy and attempted murder. Eleanor Vane had not escaped by running. She had escaped by orchestrating the destruction of her accuser and the ruin of the court that condemned her. Her revenge was complete, precise, and utterly devastating. She had turned the tools of the court, testimony, evidence, and public fervor against themselves. She retrieved the key to her cottage, her property rights restored by a deeply embarrassed colonial government. She did not look at the townspeople, who now watched her with a mixture of awe, terror, and guilt. She was free, but she was no longer merely Eleanor Vane, the widow. She was the woman who had walked with the devil and returned with his cunning. Eleanor did not linger in Salem. The town, now tainted by shame and the stench of its own misguided justice, was unbearable. Within a week, she had settled her late husband's estate, collected what small moneys she could retrieve, and prepared to leave. Her cottage was exactly as she had left it, save for the evidence of crude searching and the lingering fear of the villagers who had raided it. She found the loose floorboard, but she only recovered her remaining gold and a heavy cloak. The Aeneid, with its dangerous cavity, she left behind, tossed onto the hearth to be accidentally consumed by flame. She needed no further physical reminders of the darkness she had embraced. Before departing, Eleanor went to the jail one last time, not to visit the council, but to speak with John Poole. He sat in a common room awaiting trial, his face etched with utter defeat. "John," she said, standing before him, her voice devoid of any warmth. He looked up, meeting the gaze of the woman he had both condemned and inadvertently saved. They say I am a traitor, that I helped a man cure his wife and exposed a lie." "You helped a man cure his wife, John, and you exposed a lie. You are a fool, but you are not wicked. You traded your conscience for a false cure. The true poison was not in the cordial, John. It was in the fear that rules this town." She paused, extracting a small leather pouch of coins and setting it on the table. "This is for Martha. Tell her the cure was in her own heart, not in the bottle. Tell her she needs to leave this place." She turned to leave. "Eleanor," Poole called out, using her name for the first time without the formal vein. "Are you truly free, or did you truly make a bargain with the devil just to walk away?" She stopped at the doorway, framed against the bright, indifferent sun. She did not look back. "The devil did not grant me power, John. He only granted me the insight to recognize the evil that already existed in the hearts of men, and that, John, is a kind of power far greater than any spell." With that, she stepped out of the jail and onto the road leading west. Eleanor Vane walked out of Salem not as a martyr, but as a survivor, hardened and transformed. She carried no wand or spellbook, only a terrible, keen understanding of human nature. The Salem witch trials had failed to burn her at the stake, but they had forged her into something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and an intimate knowledge of how to manipulate truth and power.
Eleanor Vane was gone, but the fear she left behind, the fear of her cunning,
Her intellect and the terrible justice she had wrought would linger in the cold stones of Salem for generations to come. Eleanor Vane, an educated widow in 1692 Salem, is falsely accused of witchcraft by the manipulative young Patience Hawthorne and condemned by the ambitious magistrate Thomas Danforth. Imprisoned, Eleanor does not despair. She meticulously plots her revenge and escape, using her intellect rather than sorcery. She successfully manipulates the well-meaning, idealistic Reverend Alden into retrieving her husband's book, the Aeneid, which secretly contains her tools, a list of Danforth's weaknesses and Patience's motive, a family debt, an obsidian scraping tool, and a vial of highly concentrated digitalis tincture, a poison that mimics the symptoms of possession. Eleanor then exploits the desperation of the guard, John Poole, whose wife is ill. She makes a devil's bargain, a false herbal remedy for his wife, in exchange for access to Danforth's private quarters, and specifically his silver cordial funnel. Using the funnel, Eleanor deposits 3 droplets of the poison into Danforth's personal drink. The magistrate is soon struck down by a terrifying illness that perfectly mirrors the convulsions and hallucinations of the afflicted girls, casting immediate suspicion on the sincerity of the court's proceedings. Eleanor uses this chaos to plant a final cryptic message disguised as prophecy with Reverend Alden. The sickness is in the cordial, and the true instrument is Patience Hawthorne. The ensuing investigation confirms the poisoning. Patience, confronted with real evidence of a material crime, breaks down and confesses to conspiracy and deception, admitting she was coached to target Eleanor for profit. Eleanor is acquitted and released. In a final confrontation with the guilt-ridden John Poole, she confirms that the true power she wielded was not supernatural, but a cunning understanding of human malice and fear. Eleanor walks away from Salem not as a witch, but as a survivor, who successfully destroyed her accusers and the corrupt system that condemned her, forever marked by the terrible lengths she went for justice. The Library of the Stellar Drift wasn't built of stone or wood. It was woven from compressed starlight and silence, existing in the vacuum between galaxies. Ilara was its sole archivist, a creature with skin the color of deep violet nebulae and eyes that held the glitter of uncatalogued stars. For 5 centuries, she had catalogued the knowledge of extinct civilizations, never desiring anything more than the quiet hum of the archives. But that morning, she found a book that wasn't supposed to exist, a small leather-bound volume titled The Chronicle of Dust and Echoes. It was bound in the hide of a creature she didn't recognize, and its pages felt like solidified shadow. Curiosity, a rare and dangerous virus in the archives, compelled her to open it. It was written in the common stellar language, and to her terror, it was a chronicle of the next 50 years of her own life. She skimmed the first entry. Year 501, the betrayal. The keeper of the Great Seal, whom Ilara trusts absolutely, will secretly trade the location of the archives for a handful of perpetual energy gems. A cold dread pierced her. The keeper of the Great Seal was Cale, her dearest friend and only regular visitor. His betrayal meant the destruction of the archives, her life's purpose. She flipped further, desperate for comfort, only to find further disaster. Year 505, the loss. While fleeing the ruin, Ilara will lose the memory core, the only surviving record of the Thrayan people. The core will be obliterated in the gamma burst. Year 512, the exile. The exile, accused of losing the core, Ilara will be permanently exiled to a dead moon where the gravity well will slowly crush her body. Every entry detailed a disaster, a sacrifice, or a heartbreak,
There were no triumphs, no moments of peace, only the relentless march towards complete ruin. Ilara slammed the book shut. Her first impulse was to destroy it, but the second, stronger impulse was to fight. The future was not written in stone. It was written in this fragile book, and the very act of knowing it gave her a chance to rewrite it. She marched directly to the Stargate and initiated a jump, ignoring the protocols. She couldn't wait for Cal to arrive. She had to find him first. She had to confront her friend, save the archives, and face the agonizing decision: does saving her future require sacrificing her greatest friendship? The purple light of the gate enveloped her, carrying the cosmic librarian toward her first, terrifying entry.